Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. When I first moved to that town, I didn't think much about Swope Hall. Everyone talked about it in passing, like it was some strange old building tucked away on the far edge of campus that no one really used anymore. I remember walking past it during my first semester, late in the afternoon, when the air had that heavy, quiet feeling that comes right before sunset in small towns. The building didn't look like the other dorms. It was made of old red brick, darker than the rest, with paint peeling off the window frames. The windows themselves were covered with a thin film of dust from years of not being cleaned properly. A few were cracked, and the lights inside, when they were on, always seemed dim. There was something about the way the wind moved around that building, almost like the place blocked sound rather than reflected it. Swope Hall wasn't entirely abandoned, but it may as well have been. It had single rooms, which most students avoided because everyone else wanted the livelier dorms or the suites closer to the center of campus. The only people who stayed in Swope were usually students who didn't get along with their roommates, or people who stayed during the summer when most of the campus emptied out. That gave the building a kind of eerie silence during the rest of the year. When I ended up moving there during my junior year because of a roommate problem, I didn't realize how much that silence would get under my skin. The day I moved in, I noticed how different the inside felt compared to the other dorms. The hallways were long and narrow, lined with identical white doors all closed. The ceiling lights were old fluorescent tubes that flickered slightly, enough to be noticeable when you stared at them too long. The carpet was thin, a faded brown, and it felt slightly damp under my shoes even though it hadn't rained in days. There was a smell that I couldn't quite place at first. It wasn't strong, but it was there. A mix of old plaster, stale air, and something metallic. The building was mostly empty. I remember dragging my suitcase down the hallway and hearing the wheels echo like I was in a parking garage. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been, bouncing off the walls and vanishing into the end of the corridor. My room was near the top floor in the corner, and the closer I got, the colder it felt. There were radiators in the hall, but they barely gave off any heat. My room was small, square, with a single bed pushed against the far wall, a desk near the window, and a built-in closet that had a sliding door with a crack in it. The window looked out over the back lawn where the grass had grown uneven and long in some places. No one really walked back there. I set my stuff down, and for a while I just stood in the middle of the room, listening. The silence wasn't a clean silence. It was layered. If you stood still long enough, you could hear things under it. Little creaks, a soft, irregular tapping, like a pipe deep inside the wall expanding and contracting. Sometimes it was so faint you could convince yourself you imagined it, but it was there. It never completely went away. During my first night in that room, I woke up at around 2 in the morning. I didn't know what time it was at first because the alarm clock hadn't been set yet, but I could feel the cold air on my face. The window was shut, and the radiator was making that faint hissing sound, but the air felt colder than it should have. I remember pulling the blanket closer and lying there, listening. The hallway was silent. My room was silent, but there was that same tapping again, except slower, and it seemed like it was coming from behind the closet. It wasn't loud enough to be threatening, but it was steady and oddly paced, like someone lightly drumming their fingernails on wood. I pressed my hand against the wall behind the closet, but it felt normal. Just cold. I told myself it was probably the old pipes. Old buildings make noise. That's what everyone says. It was easy to believe during the day, but at night those little sounds stuck to you. Over the weeks, I noticed other things. The door to my room sometimes felt stiff when I tried to open it, like it had swollen overnight. The hallway lights would flicker, but not all at once. Just one light at a time, usually a few seconds after I passed beneath it. Once when I came back late from the library, the hallway door on the opposite end of the floor slammed shut. There was no wind that night, and I was the only person on that floor as far as I knew. My first instinct was to tell myself the building was old, that things like that happened. Still, walking down that hallway after the door slammed was one of the most uncomfortable walks I'd ever had. The basement of Swope Hall was worse than the upper floors. There was an old laundry room down there and a maintenance closet. Hardly anyone used it because the other dorms had newer laundry facilities, but sometimes the machines would be running anyway. Not spinning clothes, just humming, like someone had turned them on but forgotten to put anything inside. The air down there was heavier, cooler, and smelled faintly of damp concrete. There was a single flickering bulb at the end of the hallway leading to the storage rooms, and every time I had to go down there, I felt like I was being pushed forward by something invisible. Like the air behind me got thicker the longer I stood still. One night, after finishing some work in the lounge, I went down to the basement to wash a few things. It was around midnight. I didn't want to, but it was the only time the machines were available. The building was silent, except for the faint buzzing of the lights. When I got down there, one of the machines was already on. The lid was closed. I opened it out of instinct, and the inside was empty. No clothes, just cold water slowly sloshing around, the machine moving like it was half broken. I shut the lid and used another one. While I waited, I sat on the small bench against the wall. The concrete was rough against the back of my legs. That tapping sound returned. This time it was clearer. It came from the far corner near the storage door, slow and measured. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, a different sound joined it, like something brushing against the floor. I could feel the cool air shift, the way it does when someone walks into a room even if you can't hear their footsteps. I stared at that corner for a long time. There was nothing there, just darkness pooling where the weak light couldn't reach. The machine buzzed, and when the cycle finished, I pulled my clothes out without folding them, shoved them in the basket, and went upstairs as fast as I could without breaking into a run. I didn't tell anyone about that for a while. Everyone already joked about Swope Hall being haunted, but it wasn't the kind of place where people told real stories. They just repeated the old legend about the Swope family and the girl who died after jumping from a window. I had read about it before moving in. It was easy to laugh about during the day, when the sun hit the brick walls and made everything look normal. But at night, walking through those hallways alone, those stories didn't feel so harmless. What made it worse was how often things moved slightly in my room, without me remembering touching them. A book tilted over on the desk. The closet door slid open an inch. My window would be cracked open when I was sure I had locked it. Little things, small enough that it could have been me forgetting. But the longer I stayed there, the more those little things added up, and it stopped feeling like coincidence. In late October, the school decided to use part of Swope Hall for a fundraiser haunted house. They set it up in the lower floors, decorated the hallways with fake cobwebs and red lights, and brought in speakers to play spooky sounds. It was supposed to be fun. I remember the smell of plastic from the decorations and how the air in the building felt heavier, with all the extra people. But not long after the event started, the fire alarm went off. The loud, piercing sound echoed through the narrow hallways, cutting through the fake laughter. Everyone had to evacuate. No one could find what triggered it. No smoke, no heat. The alarms just started on their own. The building was cleared. The event shut down early, and for the rest of the night, the building stayed dark. After that, the strange things didn't stop. They got more obvious. One morning, I found wet footprints leading down the hallway outside my door. Not boot prints or shoe prints, bare feet small like a child's. They were faint, like someone had walked through a puddle and then up the hallway. They led nowhere, just vanished halfway down the hall. No one else was on my floor that night. I checked. By then, I was barely sleeping. I started keeping my desk lamp on through the night. Even with the light, there were times when I'd wake up and feel the cold air on my face, the tapping behind the closet, the faint creaks in the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like the building itself was settling in around me. Sometimes I'd lie awake for hours just staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, One night near the end of the semester, I packed a bag and stayed with a friend in another dorm for a few days. When I came back, the hallway outside my room smelled stronger, like plaster dust and something damp. My closet door was wide open. A thin line of paint chips lay scattered under the window. The radiator was silent. The air felt like it hadn't moved in days. I knew it was just an old building, with old pipes, bad insulation, and a lot of history. But that didn't make it easier to breathe in that room. I finished out the semester but moved to another dorm the next year. Swope Hall stayed half empty like it always had been. People still told the same story about the Swope family, and every year around Halloween, the local newspaper printed some short article about it, like it was part of the town's identity. They never mentioned the pipes or the weird air or the small footprints. Those weren't ghost stories. Those were just things that happened when you actually lived there. Sometimes when I walk past that part of campus, I still feel the air shift slightly, colder for just a second. I don't believe in ghosts, and I don't think anything supernatural ever happened in that building. It's old. It's falling apart. It holds on to every sound, every temperature change, every bit of moisture in the air. But that doesn't make it less unsettling. Some places don't need ghosts to feel wrong. They do it all on their own. I grew up in a small town that always seemed quiet, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else, and yet there were shadows in the corners that no one talked about. It was the kind of town where rumors traveled faster than the wind, and secrets were buried behind smiles and polite hellos. One of the darkest secrets, at least for me and my family, involved a neighbor who lived down the street from us, a man who gave everyone in town an uneasy feeling, but especially my dad. He was an older man by the time I remember seeing him, his hair gray and thinning, his face pale and lined in a way that made it seem like he had spent too many years alone, thinking dark thoughts. Everyone knew he kept wolves on leashes, bred and trained them in his backyard. No one dared approach his house, not even during the day. People said the wolves were vicious, trained to attack anyone who came too close. But I think they also kept people at a distance because the man himself had something deeply unsettling about him. He never went out much, never smiled, never waved, and his eyes always seemed to follow you when you passed by. I remember one particular summer when I was about 5 and my sister was 7. We were playing in the yard, the sun falling low and golden over the grass when I noticed him at the edge of our property. He had snuck up without us hearing him, standing just beyond the fence staring at us. I didn't understand it then, not really, but there was something about the way he watched us, the way his eyes lingered too long, that made my stomach twist. He tried to get closer, speaking in a low, soft voice that my dad said later was meant to lure us. I remember my dad coming out of the house, his hands gripping his old revolver, and ordering the man off our property. The man didn't resist too much, but the way he slinked back toward his own yard made my dad's hands shake for the rest of the evening. The stories about him circulated quietly through the town. People whispered that he might have been responsible for the serial killings in the 70s, a string of murders that had never been solved. Children had disappeared, women had gone missing, and no one ever knew who the killer was. My dad never outright said it, but he always suspected this neighbor. The timing matched, the behavior matched, and the darkness in his eyes suggested something more than just eccentricity. No evidence ever tied him to the crimes, and he died years later, old and alone, without ever facing justice for what many believed he had done. After he passed, his son inherited the house, the wolves long gone, but the aura of dread still lingering. The son was an odd, quiet man, obsessed with serial killers and true crime, particularly John Wayne Gacy. I remember seeing him around town in his 20s, wandering with a backpack slung over one shoulder, books under his arm, always reading about killers and studying their crimes. It wasn't long before the darkness of his father seemed to manifest in him in ways that were far more concrete and horrifying. The son killed his mother. She was found under the porch, hidden in a concrete barrel, a grisly discovery that shook our town to its core. The image of her lifeless body confined in that barrel haunted the newspapers for months. There were reports of how meticulous he had been, how calculated, how cold. It was as if he had taken his obsession with serial killers and tried to emulate it in the most direct way possible. People who knew him said he was withdrawn, polite when necessary, but never warm, never human in the way most people are. And yet the idea that the father might have been the original killer in the 70s made the tragedy feel like it wasn't just a crime, it was a legacy. I can still remember walking past that house years later. Even though the son was in prison, the place looked empty, but there was a sense that the shadows of everything that had happened still clung to it. Windows were dusty, the yard overgrown, and the air around it always seemed colder, heavier. There were no wolves, no one out front, but you could feel the history of violence in every brick, every corner, every broken step on the porch. For my sister and me, growing up near that family changed the way we saw the world. We learned to be cautious, to recognize the small signs of danger, to trust our instincts even when adults told us not to worry. It also left a permanent mark on our sense of safety. I can't remember a time when I walked down that street without feeling a chill in the air, a pressure in my chest, a memory of the revolver in my dad's hands keeping us safe. Even today, decades later, people in town still whisper about the father, still wonder if he was responsible for the killings that had never been solved. The son is still in prison, serving life for murdering his mother, a life that feels like an echo of his father's darkness. And though the house is abandoned now, no one dares move in. It's as if the history of violence has left a permanent scar on that piece of land, a reminder that evil doesn't always end with death. It can linger, passed from one generation to the next, invisible but powerful, shaping the lives of everyone around it. The town has moved on in many ways, but for those of us who grew up there, the story of that neighbor and his son remains vivid, a warning carved into our memory. You could see it in the way we treated strangers, the way we locked doors at night, the way my sister and I learned to recognize the quiet, cold eyes of someone who could do terrible things. The darkness in that family was real, tangible, and it shaped our childhoods in ways that no explanation could ever fully capture. In the end, justice was served for the son, but not for the father. And that's what left the town unsettled. We may never know the full truth about those murders in the 70s, but the fear and the unease he created are undeniable. They lingered long after the wolves were gone, long after the father died, and long after the son was locked away. That house, that family, and the shadow they cast became a permanent part of the town's history. A reminder that sometimes evil is not just an abstract idea. It's real, it's close, and it can persist in ways we can neither fully understand nor completely escape. We have learned to live with it, to tell ourselves that the nightmare is over, but the lessons remain. Safety is fragile. Trust is precious, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not hidden in the dark corners of the world, but in the houses next door, in the minds of people we think we know, and in the legacies that can pass quietly from father to son. The story has a clear ending in that the son is in prison, and the family's immediate threat is over. But the memory of what happened, the weight of the suspicion about the father, and the knowledge that darkness can live in ordinary neighborhoods is something we carry with us forever. It's a heavy truth, but it's ours. And it is real. I grew up spending winters in a small town in British Columbia, a place where the mountains rise sharply around a cluster of cabins and ski lodges, and the snow blankets everything for months at a time. The town itself is small, quiet most of the year, and alive with visitors only during the ski season. A few years ago, something happened there that has always stuck with me. It wasn't something you could explain easily, and it left a shadow over the town that never fully lifted. A boy around my age went missing in that town. He was from Alberta, and had come up to work at one of the ski resorts over the winter holiday. He was 19 or 20 at the time, maybe younger, and had spent some months in the town before the incident. He stayed at his family's cabin in the mountains, a modest place with rough wooden walls. a stone fireplace, and a view of the forested slopes that stretched out for miles. From the outside, it looked like any other cabin in that part of the province, but his family kept it warm and alive with the smell of cooking and the hum of a small heater. The night he disappeared, there had been a party at a house nearby. He lived only a 5-minute walk from the place where the party was being held. From what I gathered later, it wasn't a big event, just a mix of young people who were working at the ski resort, a few locals, and a few visitors who had come to celebrate the holidays. Music played faintly inside the house, muffled by the thick snow outside, and the lights from the cabin glowed like lanterns through the trees. The boy left with some friends heading back to his cabin, walking along the snow-packed path that was usually safe and quiet at that hour. The next detail is the one that no one could ever forget. One of his friends looked back for some reason, maybe to check if everyone was still there, and the boy was gone. Just gone. There was no struggle, no sound, no footprints leading off the trail, nothing. The snow was fresh and soft, and yet it remained completely undisturbed around the place where he had vanished. His friends called the police immediately, panic in their voices, and within an hour a search had begun. The search was intense. People combed the surrounding woods, the ski trails, the areas near the cabins, and the frozen streams. They used dogs, torches, even helicopters when weather permitted, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had disappeared into the thin air. The police questioned the people who had been at the party, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious or out of the ordinary. Many refused to answer. Some claimed they didn't know anything, and a few were vague enough that it made everyone suspicious. Over time, rumors spread in the town. Some people believed someone at that party knew exactly what happened, that there was a secret, hidden somewhere in the snow or in the woods that no one had dared to reveal. Others thought it might have been an accident, that he had fallen somewhere hidden, but even that theory didn't make sense because the search had been thorough. The boy's family never gave up. His mother especially made the search a part of her life. She would travel from Alberta to their cabin every month, staying for a few days at a time, combing through the areas where her son might have been. She didn't speak much about her hopes. By then, she knew deep down that he probably wasn't alive. But she continued, because finding him, or finding proof of what happened, was the only way she could let herself have peace. I saw her once at the cabin during a trip with my family. She moved carefully through the snow, eyes scanning the forest edges, hands covered in gloves that were too thin for the bitter winter air. You could see the weight of years in the way she walked, the way she paused on trails that led nowhere, hoping somehow for a sign that would never come. Over time, the story became part of the town's undercurrent. It wasn't a secret, but it was something people whispered about. The ski lodge workers, the locals, even the tourists who returned year after year would talk about it quietly. Everyone had their own theory, and most agreed on one thing. Someone at that party knew more than they said. The boy's disappearance remained a cold case, a mystery wrapped in snow and silence, and it became part of the town's uneasy reputation. I remember walking the paths near his family cabin, trying to imagine the night he disappeared. The snow would crunch under my boots, the cold air filling my lungs, and I would think about how easily someone could vanish in that wilderness. The mountains are beautiful, but they are also unforgiving. The woods are deep, and there are places where you can slip and never be seen again, especially at night. But still, the fact that there were no tracks, no signs of an accident made the story feel heavier. It made you think about human intentions, about what people might do when no one is watching. As years went by, the search lost momentum in the official sense. The police could only do so much, and without evidence there was no way to continue a full investigation. But the family never stopped. They would bring up dogs, bring equipment, search in ways the authorities couldn't, going through every cabin, checking under floors, along trails, near streams, even inside abandoned buildings that lined some parts of the town. Each time they found nothing. Yet each time they returned with hope. stubbornly believing that one day they might uncover what really happened. The town itself adapted to the story. People would occasionally notice someone unfamiliar at the ski resort, asking too many questions about the case, or new workers who seemed nervous when the topic came up. The locals had learned to speak carefully, to avoid speculation that could bring trouble. Parents would warn their kids to stay close to the cabins at night, to never go alone. Not just because of the forest, but because of what had happened to that boy. Even now, years later, there is a sense of unease whenever winter rolls around and the snow begins to fall thick and heavy. The story is there, lingering beneath the cheerful holiday visitors and the sound of skis on fresh powder. The last time I visited the town, I saw the boy's mother walking the path toward their cabin. She carried a thermos of tea and a small pack of supplies, dressed in layers that barely kept out the cold. Her face was drawn, pale from the winter wind, but her eyes still held determination. She stayed at the cabin for days, retracing steps, checking paths, scanning the woods for anything that might give her closure. I realized then that the end of this story wasn't about finding her son alive or discovering some dramatic secret. The ending was in her persistence, in her refusal to accept the uncertainty. She had accepted the reality that he was gone, that whatever happened had left him beyond reach. But she still sought evidence, proof, some trace that she could hold on to. In that way, the story had a kind of resolution. The town had its mystery. The boy's fate remained unknown, but life continued. The ski season went on. Cabins were filled with new visitors, and people continued their routines. The mother's search was a quiet, ongoing testament to love and determination. It was a reminder that even when answers are impossible, the act of searching, of refusing to give up, can be meaningful in itself. You don't always get closure in the way you expect, but there is a kind of peace in knowing that you did everything you could, that you didn't stop looking, and that you honored the memory of someone lost by refusing to forget them. That is how the story stands now. The boy remains missing. The snow holds its secrets, and the town carries on with an awareness of the past. But his mother's persistence gives the story a clarity that nothing else could. It doesn't matter that we may never know what happened that night. What matters is that someone refused to give up, refused to let the story be forgotten. And in that way, there is a resolution that is both quiet and undeniable. The mountains and the snow are harsh. The wilderness is vast, but love and memory persist even in the coldest, most silent places. When I was 13, the days after school were always full of energy, mostly because of football. I played for the local team, a small club in a tiny town on the coast of Australia, where the bushland started almost immediately after the last houses ended. The bush was thick, dense with trees and shrubs, and creeks ran through it, twisting around mangroves that trapped pockets of stagnant water. It was the kind of place where you could disappear for hours if you wanted to, and as kids, that was exactly the kind of place we loved to explore. My friends and I would spend hours before training, wandering through trails we carved ourselves, stepping over fallen branches, pushing through thickets, and climbing small rises just to see where they led. One afternoon, a little before training, we stumbled upon something that made the air suddenly feel heavier. Behind the football fields, down a slope where the ground dropped toward a small creek lined with mangroves, there was the burnt remains of a tent. It looked like it had been there for a while. The fabric was blackened and brittle, some of it barely hanging together, and the poles were twisted and scorched. Around it, we found remnants of a wallet, cards blackened and curled by fire, and a small purse that had been reduced to a few fragments of leather and metal. The sight of those personal items scattered and ruined was jarring. There was something very human about it, something that suggested a life had been interrupted. We didn't touch much, just stared for a while, unsure what to do, and then decided to tell our coach. The police showed up later that day. I remember them moving cautiously, combing through the area, asking questions that none of us could answer, and the way our coach told us firmly to stay away from that part of the bush from then on. For a while, the memory of that burnt tent lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet shadow over my afternoons in the bush, but eventually, football and school pushed it further into the background. Years later, I ended up getting a job with the local council. It wasn't a big position, just casual work, but it was enough to keep me busy over a few months. A friend from the football team and I got assigned to a crew, and the third member was an older man. He had a strict way about him, everything precise, every action deliberate. His hands were always clean, his tools polished, his work methodical. He had a temper that flared over the smallest mistakes. My friend and I mostly thought of him as a grumpy old man, someone who took his work too seriously. We didn't know the history he carried, the weight behind those careful movements and sharp words. One evening, I came home and mentioned him to my brother. My brother paused for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly as he connected dots that I didn't even think existed. Then he told me the story. The older man on our crew was the father of the girl who had gone missing years ago. The girl whose belongings had been burnt in that tent behind the football fields. She was my brother's age, and if she were alive today, she would be in her mid-40s. My brother explained that years ago, before the skate park had been built in town, a skate park I would end up visiting myself on weekends, her father had been at the construction site, pulling at the tarps covering the area where cement trucks were about to pour concrete. He had been convinced, utterly certain, that his daughter was buried under there. The story hung over me like a shadow. There was no closure. The authorities never fully resolved the case, and while someone had become a suspect at one point, it never led to anything substantial. The girl remained missing, a blank space in the town's memory that everyone quietly avoided discussing. Knowing that the man I had been working with, who spent every day ensuring everything was perfectly in order, was carrying that grief silently with him, shifted my perception completely. What had seemed like petty grumpiness or excessive fussiness was a man channeling his pain into something tangible, something he could control in a world where his daughter's disappearance had left him powerless. Working alongside him, I started noticing small things I hadn't before. The care he took with every detail wasn't just about perfection. It was about focus, about keeping his mind occupied enough to avoid falling into the pit of memories that must have haunted him every day. When he tightened a bolt or wiped down a surface until it gleamed, it wasn't vanity or obsession. It was routine, a shield against grief. Even the sharp words he directed at my friend or me were probably an extension of the frustration and helplessness he felt elsewhere, feelings that could not be voiced without breaking the fragile composure he maintained. The months passed quickly. My job with the council was temporary, and eventually the end came. On my last day, I shook his hand. I didn't say much. No words could have captured what I now understood about him. I left with a new perspective, a respect that had grown quietly through observation rather than conversation. Over the years, I would think about him from time to time, especially when I passed the skate park or walked past the bush behind the football fields. I would picture him there, that man pulling at tarps, hoping to uncover something that could bring him a sliver of closure. The thought was painful, but it carried a strange kind of dignity. Now, having daughters of my own, I understand in a way that I never could before. The fear, the constant worry, the sense of loss that never goes away. It's something that seeps into every day, shaping decisions and reactions without others even noticing. I think about the girl who disappeared, and the father who carried that loss with him silently for decades. The way he dedicated himself to work, to precision, to control, all makes sense now. It was his way of surviving, of coping, and in a way, his way of honoring her memory. The town remains quiet, the bush still thick with mangroves and winding creeks, hiding secrets in its dense undergrowth. Children still play, people still move about their routines, and life goes on, but the memory lingers. The burnt tent behind the football fields, the empty space where a daughter should have been, and the older man who carried that grief silently, all remain parts of the same story. It's a story of loss and resilience, of quiet endurance in the face of something that can never be fully explained or fixed. Looking back, I feel a sense of closure, not because the mystery was solved, but because I came to understand the man behind the grief, the struggles he carried, and the quiet strength it took to live every day with that kind of pain. He taught me, indirectly, that sometimes the hardest battles are invisible, and the people who seem the grumpiest or most rigid are often the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. In the end, the story isn't about the missing girl alone. It's about the way people endure, the way they carry their memories, and the quiet dignity that can exist even in the hardest circumstances. It's a reminder that understanding and empathy can come from observing, from paying attention, and that sometimes the real resolution lies not in finding answers, but in seeing the humanity in those who have been shaped by loss. Even years later, every time I think about the bush behind the footy fields, or past the skate park where I used to watch kids ride ramps and rails, I remember the man I worked with and the daughter he lost. I remember the meticulous care in his work, the small gestures that hinted at a life constantly measured and ordered to manage grief. I feel respect for him, and a deep, quiet sadness for the girl who never came home. And while the town continues as if nothing happened, I know the truth is etched in the land, in the routines and in the resilience of those who must carry loss quietly for decades. It is a heavy truth, but it is real, and in knowing it, I feel a sense of understanding that is rare and lasting. I lived in that town for about 4 years. It's strange calling it a town, because in reality it was more like a scattered cluster of about 40 houses sitting quietly off a long country road. No stoplights, no real businesses except for an old gas station about a mile away that everyone treated like a general store. People usually didn't just end up there by accident. You either grew up there or moved in because you were tired of city noise and wanted quiet. That's what I did. I moved there for the stillness, the silence that filled every night like a thick blanket. At first it felt peaceful. Over time it started to feel too quiet, like the place existed in a pocket of the world nobody paid attention to. Everyone in that town knew each other. We knew each other's families, routines, the names of their dogs when they got a new car, what time they came home from work. If someone's porch light didn't turn on at its usual hour, somebody else would notice. I lived with my girlfriend in a single-story house at the edge of the neighborhood, not too far from a tree line that stretched for miles. Our closest neighbors lived just across a narrow dirt road, a couple about 10 years older than us who had been there long before we arrived. They were quiet, friendly in that small-town way. We had an unspoken agreement that if either of us went out of town, the other would keep an eye on things. It wasn't anything formal, just something people did there. That week we had plans to visit my parents for a few days. Nothing major, just a short trip. I remember the morning we were packing. The air was crisp. That kind of morning where everything is still except for the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Before we left, I decided to go next door and let the neighbors know we'd be gone, just in case they noticed our car missing and wondered where we were. Their front yard was quiet when I walked over. Usually, they had a small rocking chair on the porch with a blanket draped over it. But that morning, the blanket was gone, and the chair was pushed against the wall. I knocked on the door. It took a few seconds before someone opened it. It wasn't them. A man I had never seen before stood there. He looked like he belonged there, though, like someone who knew the house. Mid-30s, lean build, short dark hair, plain clothes. He told me he was their cousin. He spoke casually, explaining how they had gone on a trip and asked him to stay and look after the house. He even mentioned specific family connections that sounded believable. I didn't find anything about him alarming in that moment. The way he talked was steady, practiced. I remember standing on their porch thinking it was a little odd. Usually they told us if they were leaving. It wasn't a rule, but we were used to each other's habits. I brushed it off, assuming they might have left in a hurry or just didn't think it was necessary this time since they had someone staying over. I asked him if he could check on our house once or twice while we were gone. He nodded without hesitation, and that was that. I went back to my house. My girlfriend asked why I was gone so long, and I explained everything. She was skeptical. She told me she'd never heard them mention a cousin, not once in all the conversations they'd had over the fence or on lazy summer evenings. But we didn't dwell on it. It was one of those moments where something feels off, but not enough to make you act on it. We finished packing, loaded the car, and left. The first 2 days at my parents' place felt normal. It was a few towns over, nothing far. I didn't think about the stranger after that. The last night, though, my phone rang. It was the sheriff's office from our town. It wasn't common for anyone official to call me. The sheriff's voice was steady, but carried that kind of edge that makes you sit up straight. He asked if I was currently in town. I said no. Then he told me not to come back for a while. He explained in a clipped, measured tone what had happened. The day after we left, there had been some kind of planned attack on the town. A group was preparing to hit the place like a military operation. He used words like coordinated, planned, and intended target. It didn't sound like some random crime. The man who had been in my neighbor's house, the one I had trusted without a second thought, was not their cousin. He was a member of a group carrying out reconnaissance. His job was to get a head count, to figure out how many people lived there, how the houses were laid out, who was leaving and when. He kidnapped the couple next door, tortured them, and killed them in their own home. It was supposed to be part of a larger hit. Their group had chosen that small town because of its isolation. They wanted to make it a statement against the local government, to use the town as a symbol. They thought nobody would see it coming, because it was just a quiet place on the edge of nowhere. But somehow the government caught wind of it before it happened. A counter-operation was launched. The group didn't get to execute their full plan. There were arrests, gunfire, chaos. Some of it happened just a few houses away from ours. We stayed with my parents longer than planned. About a month. I remember spending those weeks trying to process it all, reading whatever limited reports came out about it. The town had always felt like it existed under the radar, but to hear that it had been picked out deliberately as a strategic target made it feel fragile in a way I hadn't ever considered. I kept seeing that stranger's face in my head. I had talked to him like it was nothing, even asked him to watch my house. If we hadn't left, maybe we would have been part of their information gathering. Maybe worse. When we finally went back, the place didn't look the same. Some houses had boarded up windows. A few people had already left. The air felt heavier, like the silence that once felt peaceful was now something else entirely. A kind of silence that comes after something violent has happened. Our neighbor's house was sealed off with yellow tape. The porch where I'd stood that morning was empty. People talked in quiet voices. A few of the familiar faces were missing, either because they'd moved away, or because they had been involved in what happened. That was another thing the sheriff had told me later. Not all the guerrilla soldiers were outsiders. Some of them had already been living there, quietly, blending in. They had spent years convincing people to move there. Their goal was to grow the population just enough that when the attack happened, it would get attention. A town that didn't matter before would suddenly matter to the government if enough people were killed. That was the whole idea. I started replaying every small interaction I'd had with people over those 4 years. Every friendly face at the gas station. Every neighbor who waved when they saw me in the yard. It made me sick thinking how some of those people might have been working towards something like that the entire time. It made me question every quiet moment I had ever thought was safe. We decided pretty quickly after that to leave. It wasn't a long conversation or a drawn-out decision. There wasn't anything left to keep us there. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a shell sitting on ground that had been tainted. We put it up for sale a few weeks later and packed everything we could into a moving truck. I didn't even look back when we pulled out of the driveway. Even now, years later, I still think about how easily it happened. How simple it was for someone to walk up, say a few believable things, and for me to accept it without question. How a quiet town that felt safe for years could turn out to be a perfect target for something none of us saw coming. It wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck. It was planned long before I ever set foot there. People always talk about danger, like it's something you can sense, like there's always a sign if you pay enough attention. But there wasn't a sign. There was just silence, and a man standing on a porch pretending to be family. The danger was already inside that town long before I realized it. Leaving didn't undo what happened. It didn't make the memories of it fade, but it meant never having to live in a place where I'd question every face I saw. The town may still exist somewhere down that same stretch of road, but for me, it ended the moment I found out it wasn't really just a quiet town. It was a stage that had been set long before I ever arrived. I was born and raised in a small town that barely showed up on a map. You could drive through it in under 15 minutes, even if you caught the one traffic light on red. It sat tucked between long stretches of farmland and woods, quiet enough that on still summer nights, you could hear the train whistle from nearly 20 miles away. Most people in the state didn't even know it existed. When I went off to college 30 minutes away, I met people who had lived their whole lives nearby and had never once heard of my town. It was like growing up inside a bubble that the rest of the world didn't care about. The kind of place where everyone knew your parents, your grandparents, your business, and every single bad thing you ever did. People didn't move there, they were born there and stayed. There weren't many jobs beyond farming, the mill, or the old grocery store with the flickering sign. It wasn't a picture-perfect small town. It was one of those places where time just kind of sat still. The town had a past most people pretended not to talk about. Old stories that weren't printed in textbooks. Things whispered about behind closed doors but never said out loud in church. I didn't learn any of it growing up. To me, it was just home. It was only after I left that I started to understand how twisted and heavy some of its history actually was. The story that defined the town happened in the 1960s. It's one of those things that was written down in a book and even made into a movie, though nobody local liked to admit that. A married black woman had an affair with a white cop. Her husband found out, or at least suspected, especially when she turned up pregnant, and people started to wonder who the father was. Her husband decided to file for divorce. This was a big deal at the time. This was a small, deeply racist town back then. The white cop, instead of facing what he had done, killed her husband. He shot him and staged the entire thing to look like a black-on-black crime. His friend, also a cop, helped him cover it up. The department didn't investigate. The judge didn't ask questions. Everyone who could have spoken up stayed quiet. And for a long time, the town just moved on as if it never happened. But eventually, the cop grew a conscience. He confessed, or tried to. A judge and the mayor at the time shut it down. They didn't want to face what it would mean if people knew a white cop killed a black man to hide an affair with the man's wife. No one was punished. No trial, no headlines, no justice. Everyone walked away untouched, except for the cop's friend who got killed later in what people whispered was retaliation. That part was never proven, but everyone in town believed it. The author of the book was born in the town too. He saw everything happen when he was a kid. When he wrote about it, he ruined his own life. Both black and white folks turned on him for putting the town's secrets out in the open. People stopped talking to him. He left and never came back. But the story stayed. It lived in the cracks between conversations, in the way old people paused when certain names came up. I grew up in the same town, completely unaware. Nobody ever told me. I passed the street where the murder happened almost every day on my bike when I was a kid. I sat in the same church pews as the woman at the center of it all. She was old when I knew her, thin and quiet, with short gray hair and a perfectly ironed dress every Sunday. She handed out the communion bread at my church. She had this calm look in her eyes like nothing in the world bothered her. For years, I had no idea who she was. She was just the nice lady at church who remembered my name and asked how school was going. I shook her hand every Sunday without knowing she was tied to one of the darkest chapters in the town's history. It wasn't until my mom told me the story when I was older that everything clicked. My mom grew up there too. She told me about the affair, the killing, the cover-up, the book. She confirmed it was all real. She even remembered when the author left town. She said people still got angry if you brought up the story. I remember sitting there listening to her, and feeling something strange settle in my chest. That feeling when you realize your entire childhood was built on land soaked in secrets. What made it worse was how ordinary everything seemed on the surface. The woman, the one everyone had quietly blamed and whispered about for decades, lived just 2 streets over from the house I grew up in. She walked her dog every morning. She baked for church events. She never talked about it. She had lived her entire life in the same small town where it had all happened, and she just kept going. It was like she had folded the entire tragedy into herself, and then built a normal life around it. When I started looking back, I noticed all the little things that had been right in front of me. How certain names never got mentioned in conversation. How old people went quiet when certain places came up. How the police station was always treated like something you didn't question. This story wasn't just a piece of history for the town. It shaped it. The racial lines were sharp and deep. White people ran everything. Black families lived on one side of town. That split carried on long after the murder. Even when I was a kid in the 90s, you could feel the division in who lived where, who got what jobs, who felt like they belonged. Nobody ever said it out loud, but it was always there. The cop died years later without ever facing punishment. The woman lived into her 80s. She was an usher at church until she couldn't walk anymore. Most people acted like nothing had ever happened. That was the way things worked there. The thing about small towns like mine is that secrets don't disappear. They just sit under the surface, covered up with routines and polite smiles. Everyone knows. They just pretend they don't. There was another story too. One that happened long after the murder but stuck in my mind just as much. A group of teenagers broke into an older man's house one night. They tortured him for 6 hours. They didn't just beat him. They burned him, cut him, humiliated him. And when they finally killed him, they cut off his dick and stuffed it in his mouth. His daughter found him when she climbed through the window because he didn't answer the door. It was brutal. I still remember how people whispered about it in town, even though nobody ever talked about anything openly. It wasn't some big national headline. It was just something that happened and burned itself into the town's memory. They arrested the teens, but people talked more about how the daughter screamed when she found him than about the trial. I was in high school when that happened. It shook the town in a way I'd never seen before. For weeks, people locked their doors at night, something nobody really did before. It was strange to live in a place that felt frozen in time, and then suddenly remember that terrible things could still happen. That they already had happened, over and over again. When I left for college at 18, I didn't look back. I've only visited twice since then. It's the kind of place that stays stuck in your head no matter how far you go. Even when I'm miles away, sometimes I still picture that main street with the gas station and the 2 stop signs. I picture the church, and that woman standing in the doorway, smiling like any other Sunday morning. What unsettles me now is how normal it all seemed, how something so ugly and violent could live inside a town so quiet, how I grew up shaking hands with a piece of history without even knowing. I think about how many other stories never got written into books, how many names disappeared behind polite silence. When I drive through places that look like my hometown now, I don't see charming little towns anymore. I see layers of things buried deep, things people pretend aren't there. I see how easy it is for a place to smile at you while it hides what it's done. That's what makes it scary. Not ghosts, not monsters, just the way real things can happen, get buried, and then passed on through generations like whispers no one wants to admit are true. My hometown never forgot, even if it pretended to. And I don't think I ever really left it behind, no matter how far away I live now. We left before the sun was even up. The sky was still that dull bluish gray that comes right before dawn. The streets were quiet, and the air outside the bus was damp and cold. I remember sitting by the window with my sweatshirt pulled tight around me, watching the empty highway roll by. We were heading north to Oregon for the Shakespeare Festival, a trip our school did every year. I didn't know why I'd signed up for it. I didn't care much about Shakespeare, but it meant missing a few days of regular classes. And at 16, that felt like a good enough reason. The teacher driving wanted to get there by early afternoon, so we left around 5 in the morning. By the time the sun came up, everyone in the van was half asleep or quiet. I was sitting in the back, pressed up against the window, watching the trees blur past. Somewhere after we crossed the border, the driver pulled off onto a long stretch of 2-lane road to find a place to stop. We'd been driving for hours. My legs ached from sitting still, and the air inside the van was warm and stale. Eventually, we came to this old roadside restaurant. It was one of those places that probably hadn't changed in decades. The paint on the sign was chipped, and the gravel parking lot was uneven, with weeds growing through the cracks. The building itself looked like it might have once been a hunting lodge. There were wood panels along the outside, and a faded green awning above the door. It sat a little too far from the highway, like it had been forgotten. When we stepped inside, it smelled like old wood, fryer grease, and cigarettes. The lighting was dim, mostly coming from a few yellow bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and the slivers of sunlight coming through the dusty windows. There was a bar with a few cracked leather stools, and sitting at one of them was a man in a red hunting cap nursing a cup of coffee. He barely looked up when the group of us came in. The floor creaked with every step, and the air felt heavy. It wasn't crowded at all, just that one man, the woman behind the counter, and a few tables scattered around. Felt like a place that hadn't seen a full crowd in years. I was the first to head for the bathroom because I'd been holding it for the last hour. The hallway to the bathrooms was narrow, and had wood paneling that was worn smooth from years of use. There were old posters tacked to the wall, faded almost to white. The women's bathroom door stuck a little when I pushed it open. I didn't expect anything except maybe some old sink and a weak light, but the moment the door swung open, I froze. There was a bathtub inside. That wasn't weird by itself, maybe it was just part of the old building. But in that bathtub was a mannequin, a full-sized mannequin of a woman. She was fully dressed in a faded floral dress with a pale face and a blonde wig sitting slightly crooked on her head. She was lying on her back, propped up a little against the wall, with her hands resting stiffly on her stomach. Her eyes were those glassy painted ones, but in the dim yellow bathroom light, it looked like she was actually staring. I felt my heart kick hard in my chest. I wasn't expecting anything like that. I just stood there with my hand on the door, staring at this fake woman lying a few feet away. The light above flickered slightly. The bathroom itself smelled faintly like disinfectant, but underneath that there was a damp, musty odor. I forced myself to step inside because I really did need to use the bathroom. The stall was on the opposite side of the room, and the only way to get there was to walk right past the mannequin. Her arm brushed lightly against my leg as I squeezed by, and I felt the cold stiffness of the plastic through the fabric of my jeans. It made my skin crawl. Even with the stall door closed, I couldn't stop imagining her sitting up. Of course, I knew it was just a mannequin, but when something that doesn't belong is in a space like that, it does something to your head. I tried not to look through the small crack in the stall, but I couldn't help it. I could still see her pale head tilted slightly toward me, her blank painted eyes catching a bit of the yellow light. When I finished, I moved fast. I washed my hands quickly, avoiding looking at the bathtub. As I opened the door to leave, something brushed against my shoulder. It was just the edge of the shower curtain hanging loosely from a rod, but it made me jump like someone had touched me. Outside in the restaurant, the others were still lined up waiting their turn. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked back to the van and sat down, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had crawled up my spine. I could still see those blank eyes in my head. One by one, the rest of the group came back out. They were laughing a little, making jokes about the weird old place, but none of it made me feel less uneasy. The air inside the van felt strange when everyone piled in again, like the mood had shifted just a little. We pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the road. The girl who sat next to me in the back seat climbed in after me. She had gone into the bathroom after I did. She didn't say anything for a while. I stared out the window at the thick trees on either side of the highway. It was quiet except for the sound of the tires on the pavement. Then she asked if I'd looked under the mannequin's wig. I turned to her, confused, and asked what she meant, but she didn't explain. She just leaned back against the seat and looked out her own window, like she'd already decided not to say anything else. I didn't push it. I told myself she was probably just messing with me. That kind of thing was easy to do when everyone was tired and half awake, but I kept thinking about it for the rest of the drive. The image of the mannequin wouldn't leave me alone. I tried to picture how old the bathroom must have been to have a bathtub in it. Why they would just leave a mannequin lying there like some kind of prop. It wasn't even Halloween or anything like that. The wig had been slightly dirty, like it hadn't been touched in a long time. The dress was faded but not torn. Someone had put it there deliberately. I remembered the cold feel of its arm against my leg, the way the light had caught the side of its face, how silent that entire room had been. Even the sound of the restaurant outside had been muffled in there, like it was cut off from the rest of the world. We got to the festival, watched the plays, did all the things on the schedule, and drove back home 2 days later. But I couldn't shake that moment. I never told the teacher. I never really brought it up to anyone else except the girl who asked me that strange question. A few years later, long after high school, I thought about it again. I was driving on a long stretch of highway, and I passed an old boarded-up building that reminded me of that restaurant. I don't know if it was the same place, but it brought everything back at once. I ended up trying to look it up. I remembered enough of the route to narrow down where we'd been that day. I went through old maps, even some local forums. It took a while, but eventually I found a mention of an old roadside restaurant in that area. It had closed down just a year or two after our trip. There were no real articles about it, just a couple of mentions from people who had stopped there years ago. One person had posted that the place had creepy decorations, including mannequins, because the owner used to collect them. Another said there had once been a mannequin in the women's bathroom lying in a bathtub, and no one really knew why. It wasn't some quirky decoration like people made it sound. From what I could gather, it had just been left there. No one had ever explained it. The weirdest part was that someone mentioned the place had been a hunting lodge in the 1960s. Apparently, there had been a couple of incidents on the property back then. Nothing big enough to make headlines outside the area, but unsettling things. A missing person, an accident behind the building. No details, just fragments of old conversations people remembered. I stared at the post for a long time. I tried to imagine what could have been under that wig, what that girl might have seen that she didn't want to talk about. The way she'd gone quiet still stuck in my mind. I'll never know what was actually under it. I'll never know why it was there in the first place, or why no one had bothered to move it. But I do know the way it felt standing in that room. It wasn't just the sight of something strange. It was how quiet it was, how the air felt wrong. Years later, I can still remember the sound of the old bathroom door scraping against the floor, the smell of musty fabric, the way its glassy eyes reflected the light. I didn't need to lift the wig. Whatever was underneath it was better left alone. Some things don't need answers to leave their mark on you. Sometimes just standing too close to something you don't understand is enough to make it stay with you. That old restaurant isn't there anymore. It was torn down and replaced by a gas station. But every time I pass a roadside place that looks just a little too empty, just a little too still, I remember that mannequin in the bathtub, and I never go inside. When I first moved to Dorchester, I didn't know what to expect. I had seen a picture of the place once, a blurry one, but it didn't prepare me for what it really felt like to live there. The sign at the edge of the road said, Population 52. It stood on a little strip of land between the bluffs and the valley floor, surrounded by fields that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of place where, if you blinked, you'd pass through without realizing it. The entire village felt small enough that sound carried across it. When the train passed through the next county, I swear I could feel the rumble under my feet. I was in my late teens then. I'd ended up there because of some family thing. One of those situations where nobody really explains anything, but you just end up somewhere new. I didn't know anybody. That first night, I sat outside on the front steps of the old house I was renting with a couple of relatives, and I listened to the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the low hum of the bar down the street. It was the only building in town that made any noise after dark. There weren't any police around, no flashing lights, no hum of traffic. Just that bar, with a lighted beer sign in the window, pulling people in from the surrounding farms. It didn't take long for me to meet the kids around my age. That part surprised me, actually, because a place that small didn't look like it had anyone under 40 living there. But there were a few of us. 2 brothers who lived just off the main road, and a girl who lived with her aunt near the bluffs. We'd hang out a lot because there was nothing else to do. The closest movie theater was miles away. Same with anything else. Most nights we stayed in the village, sitting on the curb or under the bar's overhang, listening to the trucks pull in. Every night around the same time, the farmers came in from the surrounding land. You could almost set your watch by it. First, one pickup would roll in with its headlights cutting through the dark. Then another, and before long, the lot behind the bar would be packed with them. It didn't matter if it was a weekday or a weekend. The place filled up the same. We had better things to do, or at least we told ourselves that. But most of the time, we just ended up messing with the drunk people outside the bar. That was the thing about a place without cops. There wasn't anyone to tell people to calm down or break things up. If things got bad, they got real bad, and it was just locals sorting it out themselves. That was dangerous, but when you're that age, you don't think too hard about danger. You just think about getting through the night. Right next to the bar, there was a small stretch of cracked pavement that we called the skate spot. Wasn't much. Just a few uneven squares of old blacktop and a parking block we'd found and dragged over one night. We spent hours there, grinding the block down, falling hard, laughing, sweating, killing time. It was one of the few places with light at night, too, because the bar had a floodlight out back. It cast this sickly yellow glow that made the pavement look warped and made the shadows deep and uneven. I never liked that light, but we needed it. One of the strangest things in that bar was in the men's bathroom. We found it early on, one night when we'd gone inside to warm up after skating in the cold. On the wall above the urinals, there was this hand-painted sign that said used condoms 10 cents. I never found out if it was a joke or if it meant something else. The sign was old, faded, like it had been there for decades. No one talked about it. It just hung there, yellowed around the edges, nailed right into the wood paneling. Every time I went in there after that, my eyes went straight to it. It wasn't funny to me. It was just strange. The kind of thing that stays in the back of your mind like a bad dream you don't fully remember. Most nights, people would stumble out of the bar as we skated. They'd see us and walk over, swaying in that way drunk people do. At first it was funny. They'd want to try the boards. We'd let them at the beginning, because it was something to laugh at. But that stopped fast. When you've seen enough people face-plant onto the pavement, you realize it's not funny anymore. Some of them got bloody noses, busted knees, cracked teeth. When you mix that with drunk anger, things can turn quick, so we learned to say no. That's when the nights got different. Drunk people don't like to be told no, and in a place with no cops, a refusal could turn into something heavier than just yelling. We got good at watching for it. You could tell when someone was about to get mean. It showed in their stance. Their shoulders tightened, their jaw set a certain way, their voices went flat. When that happened, we'd scatter. We knew every inch of that village. We knew which sheds were always unlocked, which trees were good to climb up, which fences had loose planks. We'd disappear fast and leave whoever was angry, shouting at an empty patch of blacktop. There was one night that stuck with me more than any other. It was late summer, when the fields were tall and the air hung thick even after the sun went down. We were out front skating as usual. The bar was full. You could hear the low hum of music and laughter through the screen door. Around midnight, a truck pulled up. I didn't recognize it. It was a rusted-out Chevy, the kind that's so loud it shakes the windows. 3 men got out, older, farm-strong, the kind of guys with big hands and bad tempers. They walked inside without looking at us, but after a while they came back out, drunk and loud. They saw us on the boards and started yelling. Not playful. Not the usual stuff. It was sharp, mean yelling. We ignored it at first. That usually worked, but they didn't like that. One of them walked over and kicked one of the boards. Just like that, sent it rolling down the road. My chest tightened. I didn't say anything. None of us did. We just stood there. The floodlight made everything too bright. Their shadows stretched across the pavement. One of the guys stepped closer. His boots scuffed against the concrete. I could smell the alcohol on him, even from a few feet away. It was heavy. The others hung back near the truck, watching. We backed away, slow at first. He laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. More like something empty. Then he stepped forward again, fast, like he wanted to prove something. That was when we ran. The boards clattered against the pavement. Our shoes slapped hard and the night swallowed the sound. We knew exactly where to go. Down the narrow gap between the old gas station and the boarded-up store. Across the back of the lots. Over the fence with the loose plank. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. When we finally did stop, we were crouched behind a line of hay bales near the edge of the fields. The lights from the bar were just a faint glow. I could still hear them yelling, far off. Not at us anymore, just into the night. My hands were shaking even though it wasn't cold. That was the thing about living there. You always had this edge of danger sitting right beneath the quiet. It wasn't loud. It wasn't constant, but it was always there, like a loose wire humming just out of sight. Over the months, stuff like that happened a lot. Maybe not always as intense as that night, but enough that we learned how fast things could shift. All it took was one person too drunk, one wrong look, one word that didn't land right. And there wasn't anyone to step in. People in that town handled things themselves. And that didn't always mean talking. Sometimes it meant fists. Sometimes worse. I remember the night we saw a guy get knocked out cold right in the middle of the parking lot. No one called anyone. They just dragged him to the side and left him leaning against the wall like a pile of clothes. Someone tossed water on his face, and when he didn't wake up, they left him there. The next morning, he was gone. No one talked about it after. We kept skating. We kept hanging out, because what else was there to do? That was the strange part. Even though stuff like that happened, it became part of the rhythm of the place. The same way you got used to the sound of crickets at night, or the wind coming down from the bluffs. The danger was just there. It lived under everything. By the time I moved away, that village had burned itself into me. The quiet, the bar, the sign in the men's room, the way the streetlights cut through the dark like they were too small for it. I still remember the sound of trucks pulling in at night. I still remember how we used to press ourselves into the shadows, trying to breathe quietly, waiting for angry footsteps to pass. It was the kind of place that didn't need monsters. It already had its own kind of fear built into the dirt and the walls. Years later, when I went back to visit, the sign at the edge of the road was still there. Population 52. The bar was still standing, though the paint on the siding had peeled more. The parking lot was cracked, weeds pushing through. I didn't go inside. I just stood there on the sidewalk where we used to skate, looking at the door. The floodlight was still hanging above it, casting that same ugly yellow glow. I didn't need to see more. I already knew what was behind those walls, and I didn't want to stand too close. Dorchester never changed. It didn't need to. It wasn't the kind of place that grew. It just sat there, breathing slowly in the valley, swallowing the noise of the outside world. And the fear, the kind that had lived just under the surface, was still there too. You could feel it. I felt it in the way my chest tightened even though nothing was happening. Just a bar, a street, a floodlight. But I remembered everything that came with it. That was enough.